The picture on the lower right-hand corner there is Lauren Poindexter, who's one of our research interns, who did basically some internet digging to see what's the nature of this trend. What's really going on with this locavore trend, and or how it relates to whatever you want to call them, hipsters, bohemians, millennials, whatever. And so what she found, just doing regular old Google searches, there is a lot of conversation around these topics. If you look, for example, there at the hipsters, hunting, fishing as the search terms, you got 670,000 some hits. Looking at women hunting for food, 86,800,000 hits. Lots of conversation about this, but if you look for research on that, not a lot. And so that's one of the gaps that we're trying to fill. So we recognize that through this World Wide Web sort of searching, there is some activity around here. What I wanted to do is just high grade this a little bit for you all in case you are not paying attention to this, and you will have access to this PowerPoint presentation later. Each of those sources you see are hyperlinked. So if you're interested and you haven't seen these articles, you can check these out. So the top 5 there in the sort of pink color are articles, relatively recent articles dealing mostly with new levels of female participation in hunting. The second group there, the middle group, is this sort of growing trend of hunting among the so-called hipsters. And there's some interesting sorts of popular media, gray literature reporting going on there that's, I think, of interest, certainly to the topic of, for those of us researching this. And then the last 5, this is the expanding locavore, the food environment nexus, those kinds of issues. Those are also of interest, and all the way back to the New York Times article in 2007, which kind of was what kicked off our interest and work in this. I'm going to move on from there. What do we mean when we say locavore? This is not a precise scientific term, but it is becoming sort of a jargon or vernacular term that's come to mean something. Person motivated to eat food that is grown, raised, produced, or harvested locally. We've discussed the origins of this term. If you're interested in that in a recently published paper, we can give you that later if you're interested. One of the things that you'll find increasingly in the same sentence or in the same breath almost when talking about locavore is this guy. And maybe his girlfriend. This is the proverbial hipster. What we're finding is that the research that we're doing to try to get our arms around this idea of how the locavore movement could be leveraged to increase hunter recruitment, retention, and reactivation is that it's hard to find this guy in surveys and in sampling. We haven't successfully done that, and you'll see that here in just a few moments. But anyway, this is what we mean, what we're focused on when we're talking about the locavore and or leveraging the locavore movement. I mentioned this. There are a number of popular press books coming out now, and now even more so, there are cookbooks. But a lot of people calling attention to basically non-traditional recruits to hunting and fishing for more than just recreational purposes, and that is of interest. And here's some free marketing for Tovar. This is an awesome book, so I didn't get paid to say that. It's a really, really interesting read. I would strongly encourage you to read it if you haven't already. And we talk about this, this movement towards this other sort of motivation towards hunting in this paper here, extending the locavore movement to wild fish and game, questions and implications. I think you can find that pretty easily by Googling if you're interested in reading that paper. All that to set up the study. You came here to hear about some research. Really appreciated Mark's comments earlier. And I think you'll see a little bit of searching where the light is and a little bit of searching where it's not in what we're going to talk about now. So what we did is a multi-stage project. This, again, was funded by USDA NIFA. The first stage was a sort of qualitative analysis, or getting our feet under us with interviews with key stakeholders. And we were trying to determine attitudes towards fish and game consumption as well as potential barriers to participation. We did look at nutrition educators. We talked informally with semi-structured interviewing and snowball sampling with hunting and fishing, sportsmen's clubs and so forth to get a handle on this. We talked to a number of different sort of foodie circles in New York, and I will I want to point out, this is just New York. I think there are some generalizable things that you'll see in this study, but it's important to point out that we only studied residents in New York. We also did recognize that there were a number of low-income families starting to engage, at least in rural areas in New York, in the Venison Coalition and also in some fishing activities that were clearly subsistence or near subsistence sorts of things. So we wanted to include that in our understanding as well. From there, from that initial understanding, we recognized immediately that one of the barriers that we were seeing were that many people felt like they didn't have enough information, nutritional information, to make decisions about future participation in either hunting or fishing, and that was something that was perhaps an easy fix. Mo, who we'll talk about this more later, was able to do some nutritional analysis on specific wildlife species that no information existed prior to that, and was able to add that to the USDA nutritional database. So now you can get little fact labels on ruffed grouse, Canada goose, and brook trout, where before you couldn't. She'll go into more of that in just a few moments. So those are the first two stages of the research. The bulk of what I want to talk about now is the third stage, the final stage, which was the actual survey, based on those first two stages. So we did a web survey examining the factors that affect integration of wild fish and game into local food systems in the state of New York. The objectives of the study: examine locavore consumption, characterize locavore participation, and then identify strategies that might increase participation in both fishing and hunting. So the general overarching research question, and this is important to keep your eye on: how will the locavore movement affect hunter and angler recruitment and retention, as well as wildlife conservation? We'll return to that question here in a minute. So the sample, and here is why we have that caveat slide at the beginning. On the paper, not on the bullseye. We tried a number of different possibilities to create our sample. We tried the large cooperative extension networks in New York. There's some variability there, and also some lack of access or lack of reliable access to email addresses, for example. Problematic. We tried farmers markets. Here's where some foodies must be. And again, we had some variability problems there, and also people were not particularly willing to share lists. We tried the Finger Lakes Culinary Bounty membership, and they want to help, and they love the study. They didn't want to give us their list. We found the edible Finger Lakes. How many of you are familiar with the edible series? They're around in the Northeast especially. So there's one in the Finger Lakes, near where Cornell University is, where we work. And they were willing to participate with us and share their list. So we decided that this would be a good way to at least have some sort of sample of who locavores are and begin to ask them some questions. So that's the sample. We sent out by email the web survey based on that list. This is about 2 years ago. And we had a sample size of 1,586. So it's a pretty sizable sample. We had a response rate of about 33%, slightly above average, which is pretty good. Some of those were from out of state, though, so we had to throw a few of those responses out. And we ended up with an N of 471. Any researchers in the room? Couple hands kind of went up. Okay. So N of 471. Keep an eye on that as well for the researchers in the room. So who are these Edible Finger Lakes subscribers? Well, one thing we know for sure about them is that they're highly motivated to eat local food. They're shopping at Whole Foods or Wegmans, probably where they became subscribers, it turns out. And about 90% of them are motivated to eat local meat. So we got the local thing pretty well covered. Here's where it gets interesting. They're also predominantly 70% female. They're also about 53 years old on average. They also have at least a college degree. Many have a graduate degree. They also make $130,000 or more. That's not me. And I don't know if that's who we're really maybe going after to truly understand. But in any case, given that sample, we still find some interesting things about the connections of the locavore movement to hunter recruitment, retention, and reactivation. And you're about to see what those may be. Some of the reasons cited among that sample for eating local are here. Here's the top 5 reasons. Supporting their local area, personal health, nature conservation, self-sufficiency, and social interaction. And I'm just going to hit the wave tops. There's a lot more in a lot of these graphics, data-wise, that we could talk about offline, but since we want to be sensitive to timing, I'm not going to delve deeply into each one of these slides. But hitting the wave tops, those are the main 5 reasons listed in the sample for eating locally. Under fish, when asked the question, have you ever eaten wild fish caught in your local area? A lot of people, 63%, said yes, have. And among those answering that question, around 53% said they enjoyed eating fish caught either by themselves or their tight social networks, family and friends. And about 24% enjoyed catching their own fish to eat. Okay? Compare that to game. Have you ever eaten wild game harvested in your local area? More people said yes than fish. That was a surprise to us. 77%. Among those who answered this question, 55% enjoyed eating, again, from those tight social networks that they're familiar with. But 13.6% enjoyed harvesting their own game to eat. Keep in mind the demographic that we're dealing with. This was somewhat of a surprise to us. Now, of the 362 people of the 471 who said that they ate local game, here's the type of game that they were eating. Predominantly, venison hits the top. Not surprising. Then you have a kind of, in terms of the once-a-year category, basically a tie, close tie with waterfowl, upland game birds, and small game. And then some interesting, in the once-per-month area, lots more people are eating venison once a month than eating anything else. So not a lot of people eating, rabbit and squirrel regularly. There's some other interesting things on this slide too, but I'm going to move on. Hopefully we can talk about that over a beer later. In the Locavore fishing participation section of the survey, we learned that about 73% of the people surveyed did participate in fishing as a kid, and 23% had fished in the last 12 months. Keep in mind this is in the Finger Lakes area, so access issues aren't probably as problematic as they might be in other places in the country, or even in the state. So when asked, likelihood of future fishing participation, it's interesting that I will just point out the highlights here. I had gone fishing in the past, but I've since quit. It's a reactivation issue in the fishing area. About 40% of the respondents said that, and 11% here say, I'd never go fishing. I like the meat. I'm eating it. I'm not going fishing. For hunting, about 12% of the people who answered had participated in hunting as a child, and about 7.5% had hunted in the last 12 months. But there's some interesting variation here. About the same on, I've since quit, the reactivation issue on angling and hunting, about the same. But look at this huge difference in I would never go hunting. There's probably a lot of possible reasons for why that might be. That's areas of future study for us. Why is that? I think it has probably, if I had to guess, it has something to do with things that go bang, but we don't know. We're gonna dig into that and find that out. Actually looking for some additional grant money to chase that question down. But interesting comparison there in terms of likelihood of future participation between angling and hunting, and certainly specifically to hunting, that last category of I would never, even though I like the meat. So here's another issue that we've come up against, and this is the issue of I don't have enough information. Mark categorized that in an access sort of slide today, and I like the way he did that. And this is on the sort of social psychological access. What information am I missing, or can I get access to, which is preventing me or possibly a barrier to my participation? Well, on the fishing side, people want more information on the conservation benefits, okay, of catching and eating or participating in fishing. Then there was a lot of interest also in preparation, a little less in processing, and about 50% of the total were interested in more technical information about how to catch fish. And then there were some other topics, a random assortment of others. In hunting, conservation benefits, again, topping the list. So there's clearly some opportunities here for outreach and engagement, perhaps greater relationships with cooperative extension and others, about what kind of education for recruitment, retention, reactivation needs to happen that has specifically to do with conservation, since this is a key area where people are saying they want additional information. Interestingly, and this relates directly to what Mo will talk to you about here after I hurry up and shut up, preparing wild game meat. Almost 60% were interested in the cooking side of this. So there is a connection there that needs to be more deeply explored. Processing came in behind that, and then, again, the technical skills of actually learning to go hunt, and then probably what to do immediately after the kill. So comparing these, again, this is about who wants additional information and how does that affect likely participation. You see the preparing on the top of both categories, rates highly enough to be significant, and the conservation benefits is significantly stronger over here on angling than it is on hunting. And again, hitting the wave tops here, there's a whole conversation that could be had on this slide. And actually, I'd like to have that conversation, but it's not going to happen in this quick presentation. So let's sum it up. Is this whole interest, and a lot of agencies have been interested in this. We've been to a few conferences over the last few years where this local food trend or alternative food movements, or however you want to characterize it, is what people are talking about, among other things, as a future path for hunter recruitment, retention, and reactivation. Is this a myth or a reality? Or is this a case of right trend, wrong demographic? And I'm sort of showing my hand with that. What we do know from these data, and from this study, is that many respondents occasionally eat fish and game, but they're not doing that on a regular basis. Keep in mind our sample. Who are these people we're talking about? And we know that few of these people are harvesting their own fish and game for personal consumption. They're relying on social networks, who obviously must be hunters and anglers. And this is important. Despite the, I would say the challenge of what the demographic that we ended up sampling is, the response rates are still slightly higher than the national average in terms of increased participation. Just keep that, that's significant. That's interesting given who it was that we ultimately sampled. Participation rates higher than the national average among affluent, white, mature females. That's interesting. Also, what we learned from this study is that locavores are craving information about fish and game preparation. So there's an opportunity to do a lot more about preparation, processing, cooking, recipes, and that kind of thing as a recruitment and retention tool. And they're very interested in the conservation benefits. More information, and Mark touched on this, people don't know enough about wildlife and conservation, especially now as these demographics are changing across the board. My colleague Lincoln Larson, who's now at Clemson, and is also an author on this study, has said, even if this movement doesn't produce more license buying, hunters and anglers, it's probably going to generate indirect benefits through expanding these social worlds that we rely on for support, that are going to help support wildlife-based recreation and management. And so therefore, future research should continue to explore agencies, organization, information sources, informal networks, and so forth that can help foster these links between this locavore community, local wildlife management, and all those sorts of recreation and conservation activities dependent on wildlife. So the key takeaways for you today, before I turn this over to Mo, talk about the really cool stuff, is that based on our sample and on this empirical attack, on this empirical interrogation, if you will, on whether or not leveraging the locavore movement is going to create or produce more hunters or to retain more hunters, it would appear that this is not resoundingly a panacea. This is not a silver bullet. That's what this sample tells us. But the caveat, take a look at what our sample looks like. So we're not hitting the bullseye with this sample. I'm not comfortable leaving you with this first bullet point because this is the sample. So there's more to be done here. The questions that we're asking now are, do these white, well-educated, affluent female 50-somethings represent the locavore movement in total? Or is there a locavore movement? Or are they a small subset of what the locavore movement is? Maybe a larger alternative food movement. Maybe a larger social movement than that. Maybe some sort of a resistance movement. Or is locavorism a part of these larger social movements like the hipsters, the bohemians, the millennials we've talked about? Is there something there that we're missing in terms of understanding what's going on? So I think we've spent some time in this study looking where the light is, as Mark said in the last presentation, and we're also trying to figure out how we shed some light where there currently is we don't know how to see in those areas. If anybody has any suggestions on how we can get to some of these other demographics, we're open to that. We're also very anxious to try to build partnerships with organizations like the International Hunter Education Association here in the U.S. to find ways, especially as we move more online, to start probing who are the people that are coming to hunter education and what are their interests and motivations that are driving them there. I think there's some great opportunities to explore that. So, remembering this slide, what's a locavore? We defined it, but what I told you about had very little to do with these people. And that's because of who is easily recognized right now, who is self-identifying as a locavore. On the paper, we are not hitting the bullseye. So, our next steps, identify different locavore subgroups, characterize their prevalence, assess the fish and game consumption patterns there. Also examine motivating factors, and ultimately we need to determine what key information needs and best practices are going to be required in order to engage this area, food, and hunter recruitment, retention, and reactivation. One area that is a bright spot here is that at the sort of anecdotal and intuitive level, there is a lot of interest in the Wild Harvest Table, for example, and other programs in other states that are basically taking the food component and the recipe side of this and assuming that it matters at some level. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn this over to my colleague at Cornell University and Cornell Cooperative Extension, and also my wife, and also the person who is probably responsible for all this work, and let her tell you a little bit about what she's finding on her side of the equation, which is likely the more interesting. This is the advance button.
Okay, can you guys all hear me in the back? I'm not quite as loud as that guy. And Nicole told me I have 5 minutes. So keeping in the theme of lunch, we will be married 21 years on Saturday. So we're trending well for that.
You get an award after 40 around here.
Something like that, yeah. So we're good. We might make it. Exactly. Got a goal. We like goals. So for my years with this guy, in terms of game and fish, I was the cook. For years and years and years, I've been the cook. I have a culinary background, which made me study nutrition. And so he'd be the one to get up at 4 in the morning, go out in the dark, and come home and bring ducks and goose and various things to stick in the sink for me to clean. Somehow I got stuck cleaning everything. But I learned how to do fun things with the feathers and the fur, and I could share those things with you as well. But the food was what I was really interested in. So I am a foodie. I will identify with that population. And so this duck, beautiful duck. And so I figured out, how to make not just the breasts. I know a lot of people just carve out the breasts, which are great, but you could take the legs and you can slowly braise them all day and get duck leg roulade, and you could take the liver and make liver pate. It's delicious, right? So we would have lots of friends and family come over and eat all this wild game and fish and really enjoy it. How many of you had a really great wild game? In fact, lunch today was wild trout. Great game. How many of you have had, that's not a good example of, okay, all right. So there's a lot to be said on how you prepare the wild game and fish, which I came to realize. So we'd have friends come over who've hunted their whole lives, and they'd be like, I only really eat it when I come to your house. And that's not to say that I'm some great cook, but it's to say that there really is sort of, you have to know how to cook it. It's a naturally lean meat. It's delicious. You have to know how to cook it. So when I started at Cooperative Extension, I was like, well, great. I'll start a web resource. I'll start something so that people can learn how to prepare it. And I have 2 minutes. So on this web resource, it started as a blog, and now it's a website. There's recipes and information for wild fish and game that's in season or soon to be in season. And with that, as a nutrition educator, I also wanted to look at the nutrition and created nutrition fact labels for everything. And we did find from our research that people are interested in having nutrition information for wild game and fish. For those of you that hunt turkey, you'll be happy to know that wild turkey is currently at the lab, and at the end of the summer we should have that out in the National Nutrient Database. For the species that we did study, wild goose, it has half the amount of fat and like twice the amount of iron as domesticated goose. So we really did find that there is great nutrition in wild game. There's great ways to prepare it for it to be delicious, and we're hoping that people that hunt will actually enjoy the food, get their friends and family to enjoy the food, and accept it as an awesome source of food. So then along with that, a lot of people like hands-on workshops. We do extension workshops. I have 1 minute, so how to can it, how to prepare it, how to make it delicious. Youth hunts, making pheasant fingers, it's good fun stuff. There are links on the website for print resources. We work with 4-H shooting sports to give them resources on taking the shooting sports from there to how to prepare it and how to eat it and enjoy it in the field. And we've also worked with Wounded Warriors in Action Foundation to help them take the Purple Heart recipients out in the field and then cook and eat it. So lots of great resources that are publicly available for all of you to use and share, and hopefully we can chat more later.
Resources here.
Oh, I have some that I could just pass around, and if those of you want to take them, you can. So thank you very much. That's the website if you want more information, and we can chat at the break. Thank you.